everybody, and thank you for coming back today. Thank you for those who are here beginning the conference today as well with us. So we would like to begin our next plenary speech by Dr. Heidi Byrnes. And for that, I will be presenting Dr. Hossein Nasaji, who will be the moderator of the post-plenary roundtable, which will happen here as well in Cowan Auditorium. But before I do that, I would just like to explain how we're going to manage the roundtable. So during the plenary speech, please think of the questions that you would like to ask and write them down on a piece of paper. And so after the plenary speech, we will take a 10-minute break. We will collect your questions, and then when we begin the roundtable, the moderator and the speaker here will go through your questions, and we hope to have enough time to go through all of your questions. If you would like to follow up and respond again to your questions, continue interacting with the moderator and the speaker, you can come up to the front where there are microphones, and you can continue to interact with the speaker. But just please be mindful that we are limited in time and that we were trying to get through all of the questions. Okay. So, as you all know, Dr. Hossein Nasaji is, I'm sorry, looking for his bio right here. Do you have his bio? Mm-hmm. Here we go. Okay. Dr. Nasaji is professor and department chair in the linguistics department at the University of Victoria, Canada. He is the author of many books in second language acquisition, and Professor Nasaji is co-editor of Language Teaching Research and editor of the grammar teaching volume of the TESOL Encyclopedia of English Language Teaching. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Hossein Nasaji.
Hello and good morning. I should also start by acknowledging that I do not have any metaphor to begin with. And I am so delighted and honored to have the opportunity to introduce our plenary speaker, Professor Heidi Byrnes. Heidi is George M. Roth Distinguished and Emeritus Professor of German at Georgetown University, and has been a member of the department since 1979. Over more than 3 decades, her contributions have been numerous and impactful, and have been characterized by a deeply intellectual commitment to investigating the nature of linguistic competencies that develop through foreign language instruction, and by her leadership in educational innovation and professionalism. Heidi's research, scholarship, and teaching address a wide range of issues pertaining to adult-instructed second language learning and teaching, with a particular focus on the development of advanced levels of proficiency in non-native languages in a variety of areas, including adult L2 literacy. She has published extensively in these areas, and her publications have appeared in numerous book chapters, edited volumes, and articles in leading journals. Just to give you an idea, she has published over 150 articles, book chapters, and reviews, 16 edited, co-edited, and co-authored books, and quite a number of translated work. That is really impressive. Her most recent book is a co-edited volume on task-based language learning, insights from and for L2 writing, published in 2014, John Benjamin's. During her career, Heidi has held various administrative positions within the university, such as the department chair and also as Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. She has also filled various leadership roles in major professional organizations dealing with languages, among them the Modern Language Association, the College Board, the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, the American Association of Teachers of German, and the American Association of Applied Linguistics, where she served as president. She is a member of several editorial boards and is the recipient of numerous professional association awards, including AAAL's Distinguished Scholarship and Service Award, and Georgetown University's Lifetime Research Achievement Award for 2014. Heidi is currently the editor-in-chief of the Modern Language Journal, a high-impact journal in our field. The title of Heidi's plenary talk today is a very timely Reflections on Practicing, Researching, and Theorizing Language Studies and Back, the Potential of Curricular Teaching. Please join me in welcoming Heidi.
Good morning to everyone on this second fall day, and thank you for being here instead of being out on the street. Thank you also for the opportunity to speak here, where my special thanks, of course, go to the graduate students who, following good SLURF tradition, are the spirits behind such events, as well as the worker bees. They fulfill both functions. And since successful graduate students tend to have good mentors, let me also express my gratitude to Professor Xiaohong Han, who first approached me about the possibility of speaking at this event. In many ways, my choice of topic here for this presentation is inspired by the location of this conference. To me, the fact that Teachers College is the hosting institution is a ready-made opportunity to reiterate second language learning has long been the critical preoccupation of applied linguistics. Furthermore, if we assume that much of the interest in second language learning is actually an interest in instructed second language learning, then my wording in the title of this talk, namely Practicing Language Development, is really a way of referring to the critical role of teachers in the drama of language teaching and learning. But pursuing this line of thinking only a little bit further, we quickly encounter some ruffles, some fissures, some fractions in our disciplinary knowledge. Thus, while teachers are universally acclaimed for the indispensable role that they have, and they're habitually placed at the same time at the bottom rung of the hierarchy, where they are the recipients of knowledge produced by others. Whether the knowledge relates to their work or not, whether it is useful or usable in their work or not, whether they wanted it or not, whether it gives them a voice or not. So while any change in the dignity and worth assigned to teachers is to be welcomed, the real change, in my opinion, that our field needs is really on the other side. In repositioning the other players, by querying the nature of the work they contribute to the understanding of instructed language learning. And now I need to see whether this thing right. I think I do. No. Nice sound, but no action. Sorry. So what's it doing? It says clever down here, but it isn't. Or I am not as clever. The instrument is more clever than I am. So it's this one here? Yeah, okay, got it. So, quite simply, it means this. If theorizing and researching in SLA is to qualify as pertaining to instructed second language learning, then its very conceptualization and subsequent investigation must, from the beginning, and not additively or tangentially, prioritize the realities of language educational settings. Emphatically, this is not a matter of carving out a nice protected space for what has been called educational linguistics, usually with a slightly condescending note. Rather, it is a statement that demands our attention, first as an intellectually honesty regarding what contributes SLA work, that can rightly claim to be about instructed learning, and second, an embrace of ethical and moral responsibilities vis-a-vis the enormously complex work that language teachers do in their classrooms. My phrasing suggests that both attitudes are currently insufficiently developed, but it goes further yet. It suggests that the desired reorientation is really not a matter of choice that can be shrugged off as take it or leave it. As I hope to show, such a reorientation can become a particularly productive way of overcoming persistent hurdles that we have encountered with increasing frequency in all three domains, in theorizing, in researching, and in teaching, to the point that we seem to be spinning our wheels and are unable to contribute few substantive thoughts to what we claim to be all about, namely, supporting learners in their ability to attain competent levels of performance in a second or foreign language. So, let me venture a kind of overview of the state of affairs for theory and research in the domain of instructed language teaching. An overall characteristic of the field is the considerable epistemological and theoretical diversity, along with expanded methodological insights and capacities. The inclusion of an ever greater variety of learners and languages, a significant expansion of research sites, all of which, of course, have enabled and support and a dramatic expansion of researched areas, even as certain long-established theoretical paradigms continue to be noteworthy presences in our field. Yet, while different languages are being investigated, the vast majority of inquiries nevertheless pertain to the learning of English, which, due to its global status in the impact of technologies, tends to subvert otherwise valid distinctions between second and foreign language learning. This cannot help but create a skewed picture. From the topics that are being discussed, to how they are discussed, how they are researched, to the findings that receive particular attention in our professional imagination. Not infrequently, they result in inappropriately colonizing other environments of the field, especially non-English foreign language teaching. The influence of English aside, given the enormous proliferation on all fronts, it should not surprise us that the SLA field seems to have arrived at a state where it's overt thinking the 1,000 flowers that are supposed to be blooming, as you have heard, at the same time has created a deep-seated disciplinary uncertainty regarding the contributions that the field can actually make. By that I mean that the findings of our research have increasingly become more fragile and contested, where those environments can turn into protected niches and corners, even islands, cut off from mainstream discussions about language learning. The perception of detrimental fragmentation is not uncommon. It is easy to find various causes for this state of affairs. Those that are external to the field, such as the enormous impact of forced and voluntary migration on an unprecedented scale throughout people's lives, the influence of technology, and then those causes that are internal to the field, usually encapsulated in various turns, from the social turn to the multilingual turn to the semiotic turn. But I believe there's more to the story, inasmuch as the proliferation itself, I think, is part of the phenomenon to be explained. For what it says about how we seem to be going about making knowledge, and by extension, what capacities we have for addressing real-world problems in a way that holds up to public scrutiny and, in fact, helps to improve lives. Pursuing that line of thinking, let me take you on a brief excursion here, or an excursus, into reflections on the nature of knowledge construction presented by the British educational sociologist Basil Bernstein. The particular publication to which I am referring appeared in 1999 and is entitled Vertical and Horizontal Discourse, an essay. Here, Bernstein provides two critical analytical distinctions that he nevertheless and quite emphatically sees as being located on a continuum. First, we have the continuum of horizontal discourses, the common sense knowledge of everyday life that is often oral, local, context-dependent specifics, but more importantly, it is segmented, culturally segmented. That characteristic makes it quite possible See, it's not as clever as it says to be. Okay, so here we are. Okay, thanks so much. The continuum of horizontal discourses, the common sense knowledge, as I said, that characteristic makes it quite possible, since it is segmented, to simultaneously hold what otherwise might be considered contradictory views. All you need to do is look at the American elections going on right now. Against that, he describes vertical discourse, essentially the discourse of the disciplines, and he describes it like this. A vertical discourse takes the form of a coherent, explicit, and systematically principled structure, hierarchically organized, as in the sciences, or it takes the form of a series of specialized languages with specialized modes of interrogation, specialized criteria for the production and circulation of texts, as in the social sciences and the humanities. Since we are generally, for a conference like this, interested in disciplinary ways of knowing, a second distinction that Bernstein makes is critical. It is a distinction of hierarchical and horizontal knowledge structures as contrasted with discourses. Within the vertical discourses, he distinguishes two. And to me, they seem to capture well much of what is happening in applied linguistics, particularly in light of the fact that he ascribes to each one of these different languages what he calls weaker or stronger conceptual grammars with regard to their apparatus and ways of knowledge creation, development, and dissemination. The consequences of having both of these kinds of knowing existing in the same field, I think, are very instructive. So let us look. Specifically, a hierarchical knowledge structure attempts to create very general propositions and theories, which integrate knowledge at lower levels, and in this way shows underlying uniformities across an expanding range of apparently different phenomena. Hierarchical knowledge structures are produced by an integrating code. By contrast, horizontal knowledge structures consist of a series of specialized languages with specialized modes of interrogation and criteria for the construction and circulation of texts. Thus, any one of the specialized disciplines within the form of a horizontal knowledge structure found within the humanities and the social sciences can be visually portrayed like this: L1, L2, L3, Ln. And I think this is where our 1,000 flowers are in bloom. What is the takeaway from all of this? I limit myself to 2 points. The first and more general observation is that it is probably not best use of our time to continue to attempt to adjudicate commensurateness or incommensurateness, compatibility or incompatibility, complementarity or opposition, gaps that should or need or can or can't be bridged, qualitative versus quantitative research versus mixed methods, in light of the different languages that have proliferated in the field. Instead, it might be more useful and more insightful to ascertain to what extent each one of these languages, as Bernstein puts it, is able and willing to shift the discursive center of gravity from its specialized languages to issues of empirical description. A shift of commitment to a language, which is what defines them as disciplines and languages, to dedication to a problem and its vicissitudes. And that brings us straight to my second point, a problem and its vicissitudes. How can the different theoretical languages that now populate the landscape of applied linguistics contribute to a rich empirical description of the challenges that foreign language departments face? At its core, taking on that task would engage them in repositioning the roles of their specialized languages. In the case of those theories that prefer horizontal knowledge structures and have a strong affinity to horizontal discourses, the context specificity, which is necessary for engaging with an issue in general, is the extent to which that particular kind of segmentation has already established a functional relationship to life. Oops, and this went up again. This is not good. I'm sorry, I will just leave it like that. In the case of vertical discourses and their preferences for vertical knowledge structures, they gain context specificity through recontextualization of a coherent, explicit, and systematically principled structure as the field has already analyzed it for its particular way of doing business. Either way, and this is critical, it is context specificity that must be established in order to create meaningful insights. There's every reason to believe that at present, nearly all of our languages would find this an enormous intellectual challenge. So, if all of this sounds a little bit abstract, let me bring it down to educational reality. I propose that a conceptual site that has the needed functional relationship to educational life in language departments and is central to influencing the long-term practices by all actors is the construct of curriculum. I hasten to add that, for now, this is a proposal, perhaps an agenda, but mostly a conceptual statement, because at present, genuine curricular thinking, as I will shortly describe it, has next to no standing in SLA's theory and in research, nor in most educational practice in higher education language departments. In other words, I am trying out on you something like an aspirational goal, but one, as I am increasingly convinced, we must begin to pursue with all our accumulated knowledge and our ethical commitments. So what would it mean if we were to adopt the optic of curricular thinking? In a first step, it would require some housekeeping as far as terminology is concerned. Specifically, I restrict the use of the term curriculum to the way in which a language program has conceptualized and ultimately laid out in a document the complete trajectory of an imagined learning progression that spans its entire instructional program, from the beginning to the end. The most obvious contrast then would be to such a notion of curriculum would be the single course, which is an administrative entity, also the syllabus, which typically refers to an outline of the kinds of instructional activities that one envisions within the context of a particular course. Beyond that general description, the insights that I imagine that most of you are familiar with the theoretical distinction that Mike Long made with regard to syllabus construction in Long and Crook's 1992 in their argument in favor of a task-based syllabus at the time, namely the distinction between synthetic and analytical syllabuses. Finally, and I think this does need to be stated, particularly for higher education, but elsewhere also, it goes without saying that one use of the term curriculum that must be emphatically rejected is the textbook as curriculum, a practice that reflects the fact that the majority of programs have only a 2-year sequence of language teaching, where language teaching is essentially almost entirely textbook driven. The result, there's no reason for any real curricular thinking. It can't even arise in such a context. We need to, even if we know that somewhere we should engage with it. Instead, the issue for most departments is the wrangling and complaining about the various textbooks from which one needs to choose one, where every one of them, of course, claims to be communicatively oriented anyway, and there's hardly any difference between them no matter how long you look at them. So in the end, we are left with a very, very meager and intellectually totally unsatisfactory way of looking at the whole affair, based on, and this I think is the next point, unsophisticated structuralist understanding of the formal system of a language. So, with that background, let us examine a curricular optic more closely by referring to the work of the noted British curriculum specialist Lawrence Stenhouse. He identified 2 prevailing views of curriculum, one focused on intention or prescription about what should happen, the other one, the existing situation, correcting that dichotomy, he saw the real issue as the gap between the two, or more precisely, what we take as the relationship between them that avoids a simplistic means-ends model and recognizes their mutual interrelationship. He presented his own thinking like this. A curriculum is an attempt to communicate the essential principles and features of an educational proposal in such a form that it is open to critical scrutiny and capable of effective translation into practice. A curriculum is first imagined as a possibility, then the subject of experimentation. It involves both content and method, and its widest application takes account of the problem of implementation in the institution of the educational system. It is worth examining particular points of this kind of way of describing curriculum. They are, and this is beyond what is stated here, but is very much the focus of his book, the educator's role in laying out in the form of a proposal how they envision learners to develop over an extended instructional sequence. After all, they are most familiar with the instructional setting. The next and intimately related point is both the contextual and the provisional nature of the resulting proposal. An approach that eschews simple causalities between pedagogies and learning, just as it rejects the notion of one-size-fits-all curricula that can simply be transported from one institutional setting to the next one. Finally, he asserts the value of the framing rather than the determining qualities of a curricular statement. On the one hand, it anticipates the likelihood of revisions. On the other hand, it values the existence of an educator-created frame as a way of encapsulating the developmental trajectory, not a final blueprint, in light of a coherent educational philosophy. In our case, a coherent educational philosophy with regard to instructed language learning. What is not considered, however, in this particular kind of definition of curriculum is the extent to which a program's faculty can be expected to have the capacity to actually do this, to create a tentative proposal that encompasses the totality of the program. Based on my own educational experience with just such a curricular project, I would answer that a departmental faculty, particularly if they have taught at all levels of instruction, will be able to bring a considerable amount of valuable experiential knowledge to such a discussion, reminiscent of the kind of horizontal segmented knowledge that we talked about earlier with regard to Bernstein. What is much less likely, however, is their ability to conceptualize the project in terms of major cognitive cum linguistic developmental principles that could make the desired advanced ability levels a likely learning outcome in their program. But then, while we're being critical here, my vantage point, the latter capacity is just as much a challenge for applied linguistics, for the entire applied linguistics community, though one might rightly expect it to have had or to have such a capacity. And its members would, I think, in general, not possess extensive, potentially well-reflected experiential knowledge and expertise the way the teachers have it. So, we're setting ourselves up for a critical look at foreign language teaching and learning in higher education. So let's investigate it a little bit more carefully. For those of you, and maybe quite a few of you, who actually studied foreign languages in a US college, or even more so were graduate students in such a program, the description that I'm going to give is on some level likely to be familiar, though perhaps not quite as critical as I'm going to make mine. Specifically, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with bifurcated programs that feature communicatively oriented, largely, and I will really be wicked, content-less language classes in the first 2 years, and mostly language-less content courses in the remaining 2 years. By which I mean that little attention is paid to the crying need to support students in the acquisition of what in shorthand terminology one would call academic levels of ability. Kind of literary, cultural, the kind of language that is needed for the literal cultural studies content that departments think they wish to offer and at the same time demand of their students. Personnel, as represented by the tenured or tenure-line faculty who are not formally trained to perform this daunting task, though over time, as I have just said, they may have accumulated the kind of rich situated knowledge that is in fact valuable. There's nearly no discernible programmatic thinking as to what would actually show up in a document that they themselves have created for the entire 4-year program with regard to language learning and content learning. Essentially, as I already said, it is a textbook-driven enterprise, primarily focused on oral interaction-focused language courses. And then, finally, little awareness of what it means to be, much less to become, a competent, advanced user of the language. To make matters worse, at the same time, the educational imperatives and the intellectual aspirations of these programs are formidable. As humanities departments, their intellectual disciplinary anchor lies in students' ability to work in a differentiated way with complex oral and written texts, including most especially literary texts, that oftentimes span a number of centuries, particularly the ability to interpret and analyze them for their underlying meanings under a variety of theoretical perspectives. This presupposes not only high-level language abilities in the way we tend to describe them using such rating scales as the ACTFL proficiency scales or the Common European Framework of Reference scales. Instead, an entirely different approach to advancedness is called for, stances that explore different aspects of textual meaning making, and not only in terms of what is there, but also what is not there in terms of the semiotic orientations that can be discerned from the texts in order to get at larger underlying cultural understandings. As has been said with ever greater urgency in many publications by now, not only is the prevailing form of communicative language teaching and the pedagogies that realize it totally insufficient, if not to say insulting in some cases, the near total absence of support for developing sophisticated forms of literacy places all of the burdens on the learners, with scant support programmatically, pedagogically, intellectually, and ultimately affectively. Their efforts, the students' efforts, are truly an instance of survival of the fittest, if not to say the desperate efforts of an endangered species. And as we well know, the endangerment of that species is not true only in the United States. I'm talking about foreign language learning that is non-English. Rather than seeking the clutch of all sorts of deficitary conspiracies about the inherent limitations of instructed learning, or even pointing to various theoretical constructs like the critical period hypothesis in order to explain the generally meager learning outcomes of foreign language programs, we might devote our time to reflecting on the responsibilities and capacities we have to provide learners with a coherent learning experience over the duration of their entire studies. The project I here describe as curricular thinking. In short, we should hardly be surprised that programs are severely challenged in their educational work. So, back to the SLA side of the house. After this rather stark enumeration of problems, the obvious question is to what extent the SLA community, assuming that it makes a commitment to the instructed part of its language learning interests, would be able to enhance the capacity of language departments to take on the kind of work that I have described as curricular thinking. If one takes a broad view of the engagements that have been favored in our field, and in reverse those that have received little attention, the answer is by no means encouraging. Though my focus on what language departments need in order to imagine a curricular framework will underplay the research findings that we do have, and we heard some wonderful things yesterday afternoon from Right Mr., it is also not inappropriate to point to grave mismatches. And here we are. The major theoretical frameworks have only a tenuous connection to central considerations driving instructed language learning and teaching for college-level adults, beginning with their near exclusive focus on sentence-level phenomena rather than on taking a critically important textual perspectives. They are not developmentally pitched in a way that is educationally usable. They tend to focus on isolable phenomena rather than on their developmental interrelationships. Hardly ever do we have intricate interlinguistic relationships being expanded to lexical and syntactic aspects of language use. Despite their stated interest in meaning, they have yet to espouse a functional theory of language, particularly one that is conceptualized as a natural functional theory that posits an intricate web of interrelationships between the social functions of language and its lexicogrammatical resources, and provides analytical constructs for tracing these connections. In other words, functionalism resides in a functional grammar in the lexicogrammar itself, and not just in language use or pragmatics that continues to be treated separately as a separate category. Instead, at present, the implicit grammar underneath the research enterprise is a very pedestrian version of form-focused structuralism. Related to that, though distinct, they are only marginally suited for longitudinal thinking, inasmuch as their major constructs, including complexity, accuracy, and fluency, show little dynamicity in the construct itself. They rarely consider language as a semiotic resource that is inherently socially constituted, for instance, by tracing evolving forms of dialogicality from interactionally overt to linguistically covert dialogicality, or the major semiotic linguistic shift that characterizes the movement from oral to literate language use. They privilege, as I already mentioned indirectly, an individualist conceptualization of language use, which focuses on psycholinguistic processing issues, explicit, implicit learning. And these are unlikely to be useful for and usable in understanding instructed language learning towards advanced ability levels. They provide no principled way of linking evolving meaning-making capacities with evolving lexicogrammatical resources, and the reverse. Their constructs tend not to distinguish between between learning and development in different modalities. They provide little guidance on the characteristics of advanced levels of ability and how to foster their development. Primarily, they are located at the intermediate level. And stop. Finally, their effects to adopt a developmental perspective continue to focus on pedagogies. And that includes using task as a unit for syllabus construction. Conceptually, to me, this is problematic because it seeks to influence a particular instance of classroom teaching in terms of the extent to which it enables learners to come to understand the meaning-making system of an entire language, understood as a resource to be enacted, not a thing to be grasped. Not only is this a distance that is simply not manageable, neither conceptually nor in real teaching practice, without the aid of an agreed upon middle ground, called curricular thinking. It assumes an ability to train teachers that some of the most knowledgeable experts in teacher education, like Diane Larson-Freeman and Donald Freedom, not only reject as unrealistic, but reject for the substantive reason that teachers must have the freedom to make dynamic, situated choices, which is quite different from making random choices. I will stop here, certain that I have already triggered numerous unspoken mini rebellions and counter-arguments. But let me provide this important and forward-looking corrective to what I am saying. It is not that a good number of these lacunae have not already been noted by researchers. They most certainly have. But a number of interrelated obstacles make the discovery and the informed pursuit of emerging insights of the kind we need unusually difficult. The first and most obvious one is that researchers tend not to be sufficiently familiar with the program. Or if they are, they have the quite unfortunate situation that they do not have in that program and cannot find in that program, as I have just said, any well spelled out curriculum, a matter that then relegates them to conducting theoretically, in other words, from their theoretical language, rather than educationally informed helicopter research that involves what unwittingly, though wonderfully and wickedly aptly, is referred to as an intervention study. The second matter is this. I think there's a very strong bias against a researcher as knowledgeable participant, on the assumption that scientific objectivity would be compromised. In other words, our research posture generally prefers an uninformed, pristine researcher over one whose research would be multiply embedded in a network of educational dynamics, as a curriculum would certainly make happen. The researcher that I envision would be able instead, would in fact be obliged to consider these dynamics in a substantive way, beginning with the kinds of questions that are worth asking. At what point of the program, in what context, with what data as evidence, with what analytical tasks, with what kind of interpretation, and what potential pushback for the instructional program. I find this the exact opposite of the feared, biased, subjective researcher. Instead, it seems to me that just such forms of knowledgeable engagement are critical if we are to free ourselves from the unproductive regimes of yet another decontextualized intervention study. reason is akin to the power of the languages, to which I have already alluded. For example, an enormous number of studies have worked with either Robinson's cognition hypothesis or Skian and Foster's limited attention capacity model to investigate performance characteristics or short-term developmental issues. The languages provided by these two models inherently set up certain research foci while eliminating many others that might have reflected much more the issues that a program actually faces. The result? A remarkable number of these studies come to the conclusion that certain issues simply cannot be resolved unless one makes reference to the great unknown, the context. If one were to give the increasingly frequent use of context a cynical interpretation, one would call it a ready-made escape route when things didn't quite turn out the way one had hoped they would. This is likely to occur with ever greater frequency in the very kinds of studies we desperately need, particularly longitudinally oriented studies. It occurs as well with fine-grained studies that inherently have their eyes trained on the significance of contextual factors, yet rarely have the ability to specify them in a way that can turn into insightful evidence. Pointing to other possible factors. Oh, I'm sorry. Why did this happen? I'm sorry. Why don't we just leave it like that? I can go back. Yeah. No, I can't. Yes, I can. Pointing to other possible factors in the context is, of course, a disappointing thing to have to do for a researcher. But then, as we all know, it has a wonderfully self-serving side as well, because it justifies more research, which quite likely will create yet another reason to invoke, guess what? Contextual factors that, unfortunately, could not be probed because they were beyond the scope of this particular research. You can see my editor work is beginning to get to me. And such things. Okay, so what would happen if we were to take context seriously? If one does take it seriously, and I think we must, then it becomes a signal for the fact that too much is unknown in the environment in which we conduct our educational research. And that is the bulk of the research that we do. A shortcoming that not only for research itself, but more seriously for the kind of learning that can and should ultimately then take place in these programs on the basis of the research evidence. I see, as I said before, but now summarizing once more, I see the creation of a curricular framework as one way to fill the empty white space of an unspecified context, because it begins to provide substantive information about what is going on, or at the very least, what is intended to be going on in an entire instructional program. It sits at the crucially important middle ground between the instance of pedagogy and the system of the language that is to be learned. Stated this way, the SLA research community would have abundant reasons to strongly support foreign language departments in their efforts to create well-articulated curricula that span the entire instructional program. Such frameworks would inherently create a rich source of information about important educational decisions and actions that drive an entire program, from class to class, from performance level to performance level, across the modalities, linking content and language learning throughout the entire program. Research research in such an environment can be expected to uncover a dense network of interrelationships among aspects of language learning about which we currently have very little information, although our most recent theories, in particular dynamic systems, chaos complexity, and more generally usage-based theories, have alerted us to their absolutely central role. They make far-reaching theoretical claims about what happens in language learning, including instructed language learning. Substantiating them would not only require that one actually find them to be operative in instructed learning, but that one would be able to observe them in their waxing and waning, in their shifting connections, in the dynamically changing strength and significance of those connections, in their pace and pacing, in their relationship to each other, in their theoretical validity or not. Perhaps at some point, even such highly touted constructs as complexity might actually be reduced to a more marginal status in the overall trajectory of development towards sophisticated advanced levels of ability. But assuming that it is worth getting all of this information precisely because these theories speak to insights that have gained considerable resonance in the field, we should also not be under any false illusions about how we can actually get that evidence. To my way of looking at it, we are unlikely to obtain it without the support of an intermediary construct, a curricular framework that is inherently longitudinal in its conceptualization. And one more observation. It seems to me not too far-fetched to call a curriculum-specified educational environment a splendid setting for the kind of research that everyone also constantly clamors for, namely replication studies. This conference gave participants the opportunity to study with an expert in that area, very important. One of the key epistemological objections to the very kind of replication study, to the whole idea of replication studies, has of course been the argument that there are no two situations that will ever be identical. If one requires exact identity, then that objection, of course, rules out the whole idea of replication studies. But if one concedes that exact identity is not what the whole business is all about, then I suggest that a carefully specified curricular framework within which waves of student cohorts from year to year studied in a particular department comes as close to the conditions that are necessary for conducting valid replication studies as we are likely to get. I come to my concluding remarks. Let me take a forward-looking perspective to the question of what might be possible gains of taking the kind of curricular stance I'm proposing. I'll do it from three different vantage points: boosting nascent dynamics in the field, addressing vexing problems, and opening up new avenues. Let us go to the boosting of nascent dynamics. In line with the comments I just made, perhaps the most important contribution of a curricular orientation would be this, that it would enhance, perhaps to some extent even force, a developmental pitch in our thinking. The professional literature includes a number of discussions that differentiate acquisition from learning from development, referencing different theoretical reasons for doing so. What I am here proposing is at once simpler and also more encompassing. When I claim that curricular thinking and the kind of research it would enable and foster would force developmental thinking, I mean that it would make it shift our attention away from the individual instance of a particular learner performance accurate or inaccurate, simple or complex, appropriate or inappropriate, and will position it in a larger trajectory of things that were and things that are yet to come. In other words, in some fashion, forever emergent toward an advanced repertoire of semiotic resources. The second point is the crucial need for finding evidence for some of the most exciting claims being made in contemporary theorizing. Among these are such notions as chaos, as defined by Diane Larson Freeman, the proposed connectedness of growers and attractor states, the notion that at certain times a relatively small influence can cause major systematic changes, the so-called butterfly effect. And in that context, the importance of an initial condition to understand the nature of change, perhaps particularly challenging the notion of a self-organizing system, as that has been brought into our field from the natural sciences. Become much more than buzzwords. These constructs need to be enlivened by data from real learning environments that have to be more than just longitudinal in the sense of duration, but longitudinal in the sense of deliberately seeking to enhance over long stretches learners' capacity for meaning-making. Finally, I believe we need to revisit notions of competing processing for form and meaning. The major construct of CAF and the diverse ways of handling its components ultimately is built on certain assumptions about simultaneous processing, form, and meaning, and our limitations in that regard. Despite enormous research efforts, findings remain conflicted. A curriculum that was explicitly meaning-oriented from the beginning and importantly included advanced ability levels might be able to help us reconceptualize what at present strikes me as a mechanistic metaphor of limiting processing space that is ill-suited to the human capacity for language-based semiosis, and in fact might seriously misrepresent it. Let us go to the next point, mixing problems. First is the need to find ways of significantly boosting the interpretability of our research findings. While much emphasis has been placed on improving research methodology in our field, often by creating ever more sophisticated assessment tools and statistical analyses, and heaven knows there is a need for that, increasingly at the same time, assessment specialists, and we have a number of them at this conference here, quite pointedly remind us that the real issue is how to interpret these findings. An ability that is not exhausted by statistical statements of significance or even effect sizes, but typically requires careful inclusion of pertinent contextual information. In any case, if educational and social consequences are to be established, that contextual imposition may be the only way to enable what needs to happen, namely the crucial transfer back into educational realities. To me, a second vexing problem is that the profession has nearly no evidence for the following key information. What are reasonable learning outcomes for instructed learning? The only estimates that we have on the topic, and it continues to be circulated over and over and over again, draws on data from the Defense Language Institute, which has provided estimates on the number of instructional hours required for students to attain certain proficiency levels on the Defense Language Institute test batteries for the different languages that are taught there. From the standpoint of an entire field, this is scandalously limited information for such an important question. It can be meaningfully addressed only with a curricular framework that, in fact, attended to instructed language development toward advancements to the best of its abilities rather than leaving students in the wild while they were in the classroom. Akin to this question, though distinct in an era when we have rejected native speaker norms, is what counts as success in instructed learning and why? We have either left that question totally unanswered, or we have resorted to dubious assumptions about instructed learning in essentially a deficitary manner, where the safest bet is to have low expectations. I remind you of the American elections once more. I find this an ethically and morally indefensible position on the part of an entire research field. And that brings me to my last point, opening up new avenues. Here, for me, perhaps the most important new avenue is the possibility driven by an undeniable need of adopting a functional theory of language. Preference should be given to a natural functional theory because it establishes principled connections between social contexts of language and the actual lexicogrammatical resources that are typical for that particular setting. Linked to that is the fact that functional grammars are pitched towards textual meaning-making, therefore providing a much-needed liberation from the preoccupation with sentence-level phenomena in a structuralist vein that currently serve as the SLA field's methodological default grammar. For my final point, I return to how I began this talk, namely the teacher, who is all too often placed in a dependency relationship, particularly vis-a-vis the SLA research community. I'm convinced that one of the consequences of taking such a curricular long-term approach can reposition, empower, if you prefer that word, teachers. They will be able to develop new forms of knowledge of language, new ways of making pedagogical choices, precisely because both will be informed by intellectual and educational engagement with an entire programmatic sequence. And who knows, perhaps the SLA research community will no longer be the trainers, but will become emergent learners. And on that point, while the overt problem that I presented is the need to enhance the capacity of foreign language departments to deliver efficient and effective teaching and learning, the creation of an encompassing curriculum is not a do-good rescue mission on the part of the SLA community. They themselves are in need of a serious rescue mission, to be freed from what all too often has become a self-absorbed busyness, if not to say repetitiveness, with little sense of where it's going. Taking on the task of developing the kind of curricular trajectory that I have laid out would be an intellectually enormously challenging and, as I claim, liberating experience for this SLA field, while at the same time affirming its raison d'etre and social responsibility